Just like your camera decisions, the capabilities and limitations you impose on your character's movement will influence your future game and level design decisions, so it's good to consider those early on in development. I like to think of character movement in terms of verbs such as steering, climbing, falling, obstructing, etc. Of course, some games will have shorter or longer verb lists, like say if you're making a 3D platformer, you may include rolling, jumping, gliding, swinging, wall jumping, and slamming. But for this video, I'd like to talk about the movement decisions I've made so far for my isometric RPG. Hi, I'm BGK of Pear Tree Games, and this is Return of the Lividaea Devlog 2, Character Movement. Since my second technical design pillar is to have everything world axis aligned, the steering of my characters was already decided. Forward, back, left, and right. This is a throwback to RPGs which I grew up on, so works well for the style I'm going for. But then I had to consider if I wanted to force the player to always be in a grid position, or if they were free to roam however they wanted. Free movement feels more natural in exploration, but almost jarring when switching to combat mode, which needed to be played on a grid. It also makes boundaries more difficult. Boundaries are an essential part of any game, and determining how to set up, test, and visualize boundaries is absolutely critical. Lastly, the entire world is built on a 3D grid system, so it's nice to keep the characters within those cells. So for those few reasons, I opted to keep the combat and exploration movement the same, with a forced grid system at all times. This makes it easy to transition between gameplay modes, since there aren't two different movement systems the player has to get used to. It also allows me to easily set up boundaries, because if a grid cell doesn't exist, the player can't move to it, so no falling off the map or getting to unwanted places, at least not as easily. And visualizing the grid is also a simple debug flag, allowing me to see if there are any areas which shouldn't be there. To keep the movement snappy for gamepads, I opted to have it so the direction you press will move the character immediately to the next grid cell. But that means you couldn't face a direction without moving in that direction. To solve that, I implemented a button which, when held, turns your character without moving them. A lot of games add running, usually to help increase the time between points of interest, but I decided to keep the distinction between walking and running out of the game and have the characters always be in a run state when moving. Since everything is on a grid, there is no need to ever walk slowly to position the character. A detailed level of control doesn't really exist here. I've gone back and forth on introducing climbing into my game, but so far have ended up leaving it out. It adds great vertical level design capabilities, but introduces so much more work and odd behaviors. Not only do you have to have animations for all of the characters, but on a grid system, I didn't feel the movement cost really worked. Like, I feel moving down should cost just 1 point for the horizontal movement, but moving up should add 1 point for each vertical movement as well. But then you have scenarios where a character would be stuck mid-turn on a ladder or something. Preventing climbing also makes tactical scenarios easier to reason about in encounters. I'll be doing a lot of videos on various combat design decisions, but for now, know I'm trying to keep the combat simple. However, I wanted to allow the player to jump down one level, giving the character who's on a higher level an advantage and the choice to drop down and not force them to run around to a stair tile. This also opens up the level design to easily include forced paths for certain areas, but a very fast way to backtrack. But this immediately introduces a large problem: one-way traps. If you're not careful, you can easily softlock the player in an area that doesn't have a way back. Again, grid visibility helps a lot with this, but this is an even larger problem during combat, since the character has a limited distance they can move each turn, and they could trap themselves in a lower level cell. I've tried to resolve that in two ways. One, only jump down if the player holds that direction for a short period. This makes sure they didn't accidentally jump down. And two, in combat, allow the player to reset to their starting position during their turn. So even if a player meant to jump down, but then decided that wasn't the best move, they can still restart their turn. Obstruction of grid-based movement by your and other characters in a turn-based game is relatively easy. When it's a character's turn to move, they can't step on a cell where a character is already standing. However, outside of combat, when there are no turns and everyone is moving around at the same time, this is immensely more difficult. You could try to keep track of which tiles are not only currently occupied, but if a tile will become occupied when a character starts to move onto it. But that means you still need to check each tile not only when calculating pathfinding, but also during each tile movement of the path, then recalculating preemptively when collisions are about to occur. And then you also have to consider times when your player may be blocked by an NPC and can't get through a doorway or something. Non-grid based movement systems usually solve this by allowing characters to push each other as they move. But that would mean pushing your own teammates in a big line if you turned around, and that just seemed really silly to me. So I took the easy way out and turned off obstructions outside of combat and dialogue. So when exploring, all of the characters in the world can simply pass through each other. And then, when combat starts, your party members and enemies all jump to a free tile. The same happens during dialogue so that the speaker can be targeted by the camera and outlined without overlapping with other characters. So that's how movement works so far. Note that a lot of these decisions came from prototyping and seeing what felt right for the game, and was not what I decided on when thinking about the movement beforehand. It took a while for me to realize that just because I sketched out how a system should be, doesn't mean it had to be that way. A lot of my initial thoughts and designs didn't make sense for the game I had built. So even though it was hard, I had to throw out a lot of work and rewrite a lot of code. But I think to make the best game you can, you need to make the game you have, and not the one you thought of. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you have any ideas about the movement so far. Cheers.